Get out of my seat, now. The words sliced through the first-class cabin like a blade through silk. I don't sit next to people like you. The voice belonged to Brandon Mitchell, and it carried the entitled tone of someone who had never been told no in his 35 years of existence. He stood in the aisle of Skyline Elite Flight 445, his 6-foot frame blocking the soft amber lighting that bathed the luxury cabin in warmth. But the woman in seat 1A didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply looked up from her book, her dark eyes meeting his blue ones with a calm that would have unnerved him if he possessed the emotional intelligence to recognize danger. Her name was Dr. Maya Rodriguez, though Brandon didn't know that yet. He didn't know that the quiet woman reading peacefully in the window seat controlled more wealth than his pharmaceutical heir father could dream of. He didn't know that in exactly 8 minutes his world would collapse entirely. Maya adjusted her simple black sweater and turned a page in her book. The gesture was so casual, so dismissive, that Brandon's face flushed red above his perfectly knotted silk tie. Before we dive deeper into this story of cosmic justice, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that respect should never depend on your bank account, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Stories like this need to be heard. Now let's step inside the most luxurious cabin in the sky where arrogance was about to meet its match at 38,000 feet. The first-class section of Skyline Elite Flight 445 was less airplane and more floating palace. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light from individual reading lamps. Fresh white orchids adorned each seat cluster. The leather was butter-soft Italian craftsmanship, and the carpet beneath passengers' feet cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. This was February 15th, 11:30 a.m. Miami International Airport. The Boeing 777 was scheduled to depart for London Heathrow in 20 minutes. The cabin smelled of expensive cologne, fresh flowers, and money. Lots of money. Maya Rodriguez sat in seat 1A, the most coveted spot in the aircraft. It offered complete privacy, a direct view of the cockpit door, and first service for everything from champagne to hot towels. She had earned this seat through years of building Titan Capital Holdings into a $12 billion private equity powerhouse, but you wouldn't know any of that by looking at her. Maya wore a simple black cashmere sweater, dark jeans that had seen better days, and worn leather loafers that she'd owned for 5 years. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun secured with a basic elastic band. No jewelry adorned her fingers or neck except for a vintage Cartier watch tucked discreetly under her sleeve. She looked like a tired traveler. Nothing more, nothing less. The book in her hands was a worn paperback copy of Beloved by Toni Morrison. She'd read it 17 times, but the story still moved her. Today she needed that reminder of resilience, of quiet strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. Maya had just spent the past week in Manhattan closing the biggest deal of her career. Titan Capital had acquired the debt of a struggling automotive parts manufacturer in Detroit. Instead of liquidating the company for a quick profit like her competitors suggested, Maya had restructured the debt, brought in new management, and saved 4,000 manufacturing jobs. The deal had taken 18 months to negotiate. She was exhausted. She had chosen to fly in simple clothes because comfort mattered more than image when facing a 7-hour transatlantic flight. She had chosen seat 1A because she had earned it through 2 decades of building businesses, creating jobs, and generating returns that made pension funds and university endowments solvent. But to Brandon Mitchell, scanning the cabin with the calculating eyes of someone who believed the world owed him everything, Maya looked like a mistake. The other passengers in first class were settling in for the long flight. An elderly white couple, Robert and Helen Caldwell, occupied seats 3A and 3B. Robert was a retired federal judge, Helen a former university dean. They had paid for their tickets with retirement savings for their 50th wedding anniversary trip to London. In seat 2C sat James Liu, a 29-year-old tech blogger with 2.3 million YouTube subscribers. James was documenting his first-ever first-class experience for his travel vlog. His phone was already out capturing the luxury amenities for his audience who dreamed of experiencing such opulence. The cabin crew moved efficiently through their pre-flight routines. Sofia Martinez, the lead first-class flight attendant, checked passenger manifests on her tablet while distributing hot towels and offering pre-departure beverages. Sofia was 24 years old, from Queens, New York. This was her first month working first-class service after being promoted from economy. She had studied hospitality management at community college while working 2 jobs to support her younger brother through high school. Every passenger intimidated her. Every request felt like a test she might fail. The pressure to provide flawless service to wealthy travelers who could complain to corporate and end her career with a single phone call kept her awake at night. But Maya had been kind to her. When Sofia had nervously approached seat 1A 15 minutes earlier, Maya had looked up from her book with a warm smile. "Good morning, Sofia," Maya had said, reading the name tag pinned to Sofia's crisp uniform. "How are you feeling about your first-class flight?" The question had caught Sofia off guard. Passengers didn't usually ask about her feelings. A little nervous, honestly, Sofia had admitted. "You'll do great," Maya had assured her. "Just breathe and remember that we're all just people trying to get somewhere safely." That small kindness had steadied Sofia's nerves. Maya had declined the offered Dom Perignon and requested sparkling water with lime. No special requests, no attitude, no demands. Just basic human decency. Now, as Brandon Mitchell stood over seat 1A with his face twisted in entitled rage, Sofia felt her stomach drop. She recognized that look. She had seen it before in passengers who viewed the crew as servants rather than people. The cabin fell silent. Conversation stopped. Even the hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit seemed muted. Maya slowly placed a bookmark between the pages of her novel and set it on the small table beside her seat. She looked up at Brandon with the same calm expression she wore during hostile takeover negotiations. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying a slight Texas accent that spoke of humble origins. "Was there something you needed, Brandon?" Mitchell adjusted his $8,000 Armani suit and straightened his silk tie. His blonde hair was slicked back with expensive pomade, and his blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had never worked for anything in his life. He was the son of Harrison Mitchell, the pharmaceutical mogul who controlled a $3 billion empire built on patents for life-saving medications. Brandon had attended Harvard Business School not because he was intelligent, but because his father had donated enough money to fund a new library wing. At 35, Brandon held the title of Vice President of Strategic Development at Mitchell Pharmaceuticals. It was a meaningless position that allowed him to claim he worked while spending his days on golf courses and in exclusive clubs. He was accustomed to deference. He expected it. "This is my seat," Brandon announced, waving a boarding pass like a weapon. His voice carried the nasal tone of someone who had grown up in Connecticut boarding schools. "There's been some kind of mix-up." Sofia Martinez stepped forward from the galley, her tablet clutched against her chest like armor. "Sir, I can check the seating arrangement for you," she offered, her accent revealing her Queen's roots. Brandon barely glanced at her. To him, flight attendants were invisible until he needed something. "Don't bother," he dismissed with a wave of his manicured hand. "I can see what happened here. Someone's been upgraded who shouldn't have been." His eyes fixed on Maya with the predatory focus of a shark scenting blood in the water. Maya remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "My boarding pass clearly shows. Seat 1A, she said evenly. "Perhaps you should double-check your assignment." Brandon laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the cabin's peaceful atmosphere. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't know what frequent flyer miles you cashed in or what sympathy story you told the gate agent, but this is where important people sit. The word important dripped with condescension. Robert Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in seat 3A. As a retired federal judge, he had witnessed enough discrimination to recognize it when he saw it developing. His wife Helen reached for his hand, her face troubled. James Liu's instincts as a content creator kicked in. This felt like something his audience would need to see. He discreetly positioned his phone to capture the interaction while pretending to scroll through messages. Captain David Torres emerged from the cockpit, drawn by the commotion. At 45, Torres had 20 years of experience flying for major airlines. He was a consummate professional who prided himself on running smooth, incident-free flights. He was also the son of Mexican immigrants who had worked 3 jobs to put him through flight school. He understood prejudice, but he also understood corporate hierarchies. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Torres asked, his voice carrying the authority of his 4 gold stripes. Brandon turned to face the captain, his expression brightening with the confidence of someone about to play a winning card. "Captain, thank goodness. There's been a seating error. This woman," he gestured toward Maya without looking at her, "is in my assigned seat. I specifically requested 1A for this flight." Captain Torres looked at his passenger manifest on the tablet Sophia handed him. "Mr. Mitchell, according to our records, you're assigned to seat 2A, Doctor. Rodriguez is confirmed in 1A. Dr. Rodriguez. Brandon's eyebrows shot up in theatrical surprise. Doctor of what sociology? He laughed at his own perceived wit. Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the first crack in her composed facade. Sophia watched the exchange with growing distress. She had seen this movie before. Wealthy passengers made demands and corporate policies bent to accommodate them. The crew who tried to stand up for fairness often found themselves looking for new jobs. But something about Maya made Sophia want to fight for her. Maybe it was the kindness Maya had shown earlier, or maybe it was the quiet dignity with which she faced Brandon's assault. Sir Sophia interjected, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Dr. Rodriguez purchased a full-fare first-class ticket. Her reservation is confirmed. Brandon fixed Sophia with a withering stare that had made grown men apologize for existing. "Did I ask you?" he snapped. "Go get me a real flight attendant, someone with actual authority." Sophia's face flushed red, but Maya spoke before she could respond. "Sophia has all the authority she needs," Maya said quietly. "And she's been nothing but professional." The simple defense of the young flight attendant sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. Brandon's face darkened. "Oh, I see," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You two are going to stick together. How touching." The racial undertone in his words was unmistakable. James Liu stopped pretending to scroll through his phone. This was definitely going to be content. He opened his Instagram app and started a live stream, holding his phone low but positioned to capture the confrontation. Going live from first class, he typed quickly, "You won't believe what's happening right now." Within seconds, viewers began joining the stream. Comments started flowing. "What airline is this? Is this really happening? Someone's about to get fired." The viewer count climbed steadily, 50, 100, 50, 400, 800. Captain Torres felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. He had passengers watching crew members looking to him for leadership and a potential discrimination incident developing on his aircraft. He also knew that Brandon Mitchell's father controlled pharmaceutical shipping contracts worth $15 million annually to Skyline Elite's cargo division. That kind of money bought influence at the corporate level. Dr. Rodriguez. Captain Torres said carefully, "Would you be willing to accept an upgrade to our business class cabin? We can offer you seat 4D, which has excellent amenities." Maya's calm finally cracked. Her voice remained level, but fire flickered in her dark eyes. "You're asking me to move to a lower class of service to accommodate his prejudice. I'm asking you to help us resolve this situation." Torres replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Brandon smirked. Smart woman. Take the business class seat and be grateful. Maya stood slowly. At 5'6", she wasn't physically imposing, but something in her bearing made Brandon take an involuntary step backward. Captain Torres, she said. I want it noted that you are asking a paying passenger to accept inferior service to placate a man who believes his bigotry should be company policy. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Helen Caldwell whispered to her husband, This is wrong, Robert. Someone should do something. But Robert Caldwell, a man who had spent 30 years on the federal bench fighting injustice, found himself paralyzed by the social dynamics of the situation. He was supposed to be retired on vacation, not fighting other people's battles. James Lou's live stream hit 1,500 viewers. Comments flooded in faster than he could read them. Call the ACLU. This is why I never fly first class. Get this man's name. Someone film this properly. Sophia Martinez watched Maya's dignity in the face of institutional failure and felt ashamed of her own silence. But she also knew that speaking up meant risking the job that supported her family. The cabin air grew thick with tension. Everyone waited to see what Maya Rodriguez would do next. Brandon Mitchell pulled out his iPhone 15 Pro Max and waved it like a badge of authority. The diamond-encrusted case caught the cabin lighting as he scrolled through his contacts. Since we're playing games, he announced to the cabin, let me make a call that will clear this up immediately. He found the number he wanted and hit dial, placing the phone on speaker with theatrical flair. The ringtone echoed through the first-class cabin as every passenger leaned forward to listen. Mitchell Pharmaceutical's Harrison Mitchell's office. A crisp voice answered. Jennifer, it's Brandon. Put my father on immediately. Emergency. One moment, sir. Brandon looked around the cabin with a satisfied smirk. Some of you might recognize the name, he said conversationally. Mitchell Pharmaceuticals. We develop drugs that keep people alive. Important work. Maya remained standing beside her seat watching Brandon perform for his captive audience. Her expression was unreadable, but her right hand had moved to rest on her phone in her back pocket. Brandon Harrison Mitchell's voice boomed through the speaker, tinged with irritation. I'm in the middle of an FDA presentation. This better be important. Dad, I'm on Skyline Elite Flight 445 to London. Corporate conference. Remember, the airline has screwed up my seat assignment. They've put some nobody in first class and expect me to sit behind her for 7 hours. A pause. Then Harrison's voice, colder now. Handle it. I'm trying, but the captain is being difficult. He claims this woman has a legitimate ticket. What's the captain's name? Brandon looked at Captain Torres's name badge. Torres. David Torres. Another pause, longer this time. Captain Torres. Harrison Mitchell's voice filled the cabin. This is Harrison Mitchell. My firm ships $12 million worth of pharmaceutical products annually through Skyline Elite's cargo division. My son requires Seat 1A for medical reasons. I trust you'll accommodate this request. Captain Torres felt sweat break out on his forehead. $12 million. He thought of his mortgage, his daughter's college tuition, his pension plan that depended on 25 years of service. Mr. Mitchell, sir, I understand your position, but nothing. Harrison interrupted. My son suffers from severe anxiety in confined spaces. He requires the window seat for psychological comfort. Surely your other passenger can be reasonable about a medical accommodation. It was a lie, and everyone in the cabin knew it. But it was a lie wrapped in language that gave Captain Torres political cover. Maya listened to the fabrication with growing amazement. She had witnessed corporate corruption, political manipulation, and boardroom backstabbing throughout her career, but the shameless audacity of the Mitchell family still surprised her. James Lou's live stream had passed 3,000 viewers. Comments were flying. This is insane. Medical accommodation. My ass. What airline is this? I'm never flying them. Someone needs to stand up to this asshole. Sofia Martinez stood frozen in the galley, watching her captain cave to pressure from a pharmaceutical mogul she'd never heard of. She thought of her training sessions about passenger rights and equal treatment, all of which were apparently meaningless when money talked. Dr. Rodriguez Captain Torres said, his voice defeated. I'm going to have to ask you to take seat 4D in business class. The airline will provide full compensation for the inconvenience. Compensation. Maya's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Sofia's skin prickle. What compensation would you suggest for being treated as a second-class citizen because of my race? This isn't about race, Brandon protested, but his father's voice cut him off. Son, get off the phone. Handle this professionally. The line went dead. Brandon pocketed his phone and turned to Maya with triumph written across his features. Nothing personal, honey. Just business. I'm sure you understand. Maya looked around the cabin. Every passenger was staring at her. Some with sympathy, others with curiosity. A few with the uncomfortable shame of witnessing injustice and doing nothing to stop it. She saw Sofia Martinez standing behind the galley counter, tears threatening to spill from her young eyes. She saw James Liu holding his phone, documenting everything for thousands of viewers. She saw Robert and Helen Caldwell, an elderly couple who had probably lived through the civil rights era and should know better than to stay silent. And she saw Captain Torres, a man whose last name suggested he might understand discrimination, but who had chosen corporate safety over moral courage. Maya made her decision. No, she said simply. Brandon blinked. What did you say I said? No, I'm not moving. Brandon's face flushed darker. Listen, lady, I just got you a business class seat for the price of economy. Take the deal and be grateful. I didn't pay economy prices, Maya replied evenly. I paid full first-class fare for this seat. $7,400. I earned this seat through 20 years of building businesses and creating jobs. I will not surrender it to accommodate your prejudice. The cabin fell silent except for the ambient hum of the aircraft systems. Brandon took a step closer to Maya's seat, invading her personal space. At 6 feet tall, he used his height as an intimidation tactic that had worked in countless boardroom confrontations. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Maya looked up at him without flinching. A spoiled child who's never been told no. Several passengers gasped audibly. James Liu's viewer count spiked past 5,000 as word of the confrontation spread across social media. Brandon's composure cracked completely. You arrogant bitch, he snarled loud enough for every passenger to hear clearly. People like you need to learn your place. The mask was off now. The polite fiction of medical accommodation evaporated, leaving raw bigotry exposed for everyone to see. Robert Caldwell finally found his voice. Young man, that language is completely inappropriate. Brandon whirled to face the elderly judge. Mind your own business, old man. This doesn't concern you. Discrimination concerns everyone, Helen Caldwell said firmly, speaking up for the first time. You should be ashamed of yourself. I should be ashamed, Brandon laughed harshly. I'm not the one trying to steal first-class seats I can't afford. Maya stood up slowly, drawing herself to her full height. Though she was smaller than Brandon physically, something in her bearing made him instinctively step back. Mr. Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying absolute authority. You are about to make the worst mistake of your privileged life. Brandon recovered his bravado quickly. Is that a threat? It's a fact. Maya reached into her back pocket and pulled out her phone. It was a simple iPhone 14. No diamond case, no gold plating. Just a working tool. She scrolled through her contacts and found the number she needed. "Since you've chosen to make this a business matter," she said, her thumb hovering over the call button, "let's handle it as a business matter." Brandon smirked. "Who are you going to call your lawyer? This isn't discrimination, it's customer service." Maya's thumb moved to the call button, but she paused. "Before I make this call," she said, looking around the cabin at every passenger and crew member, "I want everyone to be clear about what just happened here. Captain Torres ordered a paying customer to accept inferior service to accommodate the racial prejudice of another passenger whose family threatened the airline's cargo contracts." Captain Torres opened his mouth to protest, but Maya continued. "Mr. Mitchell believes his father's pharmaceutical shipping business gives him the right to verbally assault passengers and airline crew, and every person in this cabin has chosen to either participate in or witness discrimination without meaningful intervention." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Sofia Martinez stepped forward from the galley. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "I want to apologize. This is not who we're supposed to be as an airline. Don't apologize to her," Brandon snapped. "You work for the passengers, not the other way around." Sofia turned to face him. "I work for all passengers equally, and you're not acting like a passenger. You're acting like a bully." The confrontation had now spread beyond Maya and Brandon to encompass the entire cabin crew and passenger manifest. James Liu's live stream approached 8,000 viewers as notifications spread across Instagram and Twitter. Maya looked at her phone one more time, then at Brandon Mitchell. "Last chance," she said quietly. "Apologize to Sofia, take your assigned seat, and we can all pretend this never happened." Brandon's ego wouldn't allow retreat. Not in front of passengers, not in front of crew, not when he was being recorded. "Go ahead and make your call," he sneered. "Call whoever you want. I'll still be in first class when this plane lands in London, and you'll still be nobody." Maya nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. She pressed the call button. Titan Capital Holdings. Elizabeth Cross's office. The voice that answered Maya's call was crisp, professional, and immediately recognizable to anyone who followed financial news. Maya had reached the direct line of Elizabeth Cross, the CEO of Titan Capital Holdings, and one of the most powerful women on Wall Street. "Elizabeth, it's Maya. I need you to execute Protocol 7 immediately." The cabin fell silent. Even Brandon stopped posturing as he processed the implications of Maya calling someone who answered with the name of a major investment firm. Maya Elizabeth Cross's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker. "Where are you?" "You're supposed to be on a flight to London. I'm on Skyline Elite Flight 445 at Miami International. I've been ordered to move from my paid first-class seat to accommodate a passenger who believes his pharmaceutical family's shipping contracts give him the right to verbally assault your managing partner." A long pause filled the cabin. The only sounds were the aircraft's auxiliary power unit and the quiet hum of James Liu's live stream, which had passed 12,000 viewers. "Did you say Skyline Elite?" Elizabeth's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Captain Torres's blood run cold. "Skyline Elite Flight 445. Captain David Torres ordered me to accept inferior seating to placate Brandon Mitchell, whose father threatened the airline's pharmaceutical shipping contracts if his son wasn't given my seat." Another pause longer this time. Maya Elizabeth said slowly, "Remind me of our current position with Skyline Elite's debt structure." Brandon Mitchell frowned, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. He had expected Maya to call a lawyer or civil rights organization. This conversation was heading in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Maya smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "We hold $847 million in Skyline Elite debt across 3 tranches. The refinancing agreement requires our signature by Friday to avoid immediate call provisions." Captain Torres felt the world shift beneath his feet. $847 million. That wasn't customer complaint territory. That was institutional ownership level money. And the Mitchell family pharmaceutical interests. Elizabeth continued, her voice sharp with calculation. Mitchell Pharmaceuticals carries approximately $2.1 billion in leveraged buyout debt through Hartman Capital, which we acquired last month. Harrison Mitchell personally guaranteed $600 million of that structure. Brandon's face had gone pale. The names and numbers meant nothing to him individually, but the tone of the conversation suggested forces beyond his understanding were converging. James Liu's live stream exploded with comments as financially literate viewers began to grasp the implications. Holy shit, she owns their debt. This is about to get real. Someone is about to lose everything. She's the bank. Elizabeth Cross's laughter carried through the phone's speaker, cold and predatory. Protocol 7. You said? Full institutional response. Full response. Maya confirmed. I want the Skyline Elite refinancing frozen immediately. I want the Mitchell Pharmaceuticals debt called in within 24 hours. And I want every executive who enabled this discrimination identified for our institutional blacklist. Consider it done. Maya. Are you recording this conversation? James Liu in seat 2C is live streaming to approximately 15,000 viewers. Everything is documented. Brandon finally found his voice. What the hell is happening here? Maya looked at him with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had been patient enough to let her prey walk into the trap. What's happening, Mr. Mitchell, is that you just verbally assaulted the woman who controls your family's financial future. She turned to Captain Torres, who looked like he might vomit. Captain, meet Dr. Maya Rodriguez, managing partner of Titan Capital Holdings. We own more of this airline than your board of directors does. The phone was still connected to Elizabeth Cross, who had begun issuing rapid-fire instructions to unseen assistants. Jennifer, get me the Skyline Elite Credit Facility managers immediately. Tell them we're exercising our acceleration clauses, effective immediately. Yes, all $847 million? No, this is not a negotiation. Captain Torres found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Dr. Rodriguez, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, Maya replied evenly. Because you made assumptions based on my appearance rather than my credentials. Just like Mr. Mitchell did. Brandon's confidence had completely evaporated. The pharmaceutical heir, who had swaggered into first class demanding immediate service, now stood frozen as the implications of his arrogance became clear. This is impossible, he stammered. You can't be. A black woman in a position of real power, Maya finished. Mr. Mitchell, your limited imagination is about to become a very expensive problem. Elizabeth Cross's voice cut through the cabin again. Maya, I've got Harrison Mitchell's financial profile pulled up. $2.1 billion in total debt exposure, personal guarantees on $600 million. If we call the loans tomorrow, he'll be forced into bankruptcy proceedings within a week. Call them, Maya said without hesitation. Wait, Brandon shouted, panic finally breaking through his entitled facade. You can't do that. You don't understand, that's my inheritance. Was your inheritance? Maya corrected. Past tense. Sophia Martinez watched the exchange with growing amazement. The quiet, kind woman who had asked about her feelings and requested simple sparkling water was systematically dismantling a pharmaceutical empire with a series of phone calls. Robert and Helen Caldwell exchanged glances that communicated 5 decades of shared understanding. They had witnessed institutional power in action, but rarely wielded with such surgical precision. James Liu's live stream had become a viral sensation. Viewer count approached 25,000 as the clip spread across Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Comments flooded in from around the world. This is the greatest thing I've ever seen. Titan Capital equals Titan revenge. She's about to bankrupt a bigot justice served at 30,000 feet. Captain Torres realized his career was probably over, regardless of what happened next. But watching Brandon Mitchell's smug confidence crumble sparked something that felt like justice. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. My actions were inexcusable." "Your actions were exactly what I expected," Maya replied. "Corporate pressure overcame moral courage. It's a common failure." She turned to address the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've all witnessed something important today. You've seen how privilege operates when it believes nobody is watching." Mr. Mitchell felt entitled to my seat because he assumed I lacked the power to resist his family's influence. Brandon tried one more desperate gambit. "My father will sue you. This is extortion." Maya's laugh was genuinely amused. "Mr. Mitchell, extortion requires illegal demands. I'm simply exercising legitimate contractual rights that your family's business signed willingly. Your father leveraged his entire empire to fund expansion. Those debts come due when creditors lose confidence in management. And discrimination against airline passengers suggests very poor management judgment," Elizabeth Cross added from the phone. The conversation had attracted attention beyond the first-class cabin. Flight attendants from economy class had gathered in the galley to listen. Ground crew outside the aircraft could see passengers crowded against windows, phones out recording everything. Patricia Williams, the gate supervisor, appeared at the aircraft door. She had been monitoring radio chatter between the cockpit and ground control, trying to understand why Flight 445 hadn't pushed back from the gate. "Captain Torres," she called from the doorway. "We have a situation developing here. Corporate is receiving calls from major financial institutions about this aircraft." Maya looked at her phone where Elizabeth Cross was still coordinating the institutional response to Brandon's discrimination. "Elizabeth, are our legal and communications teams involved yet? Full deployment. Legal is drafting the press release about Skyline Elite's discriminatory practices. Communications is coordinating with the NAACPACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center. This becomes a federal case study in corporate-enabled discrimination." Brandon Mitchell finally grasped the magnitude of what he had triggered. This wasn't just about losing a seat. This was about destroying everything his family had built over 3 generations. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "I'll apologize. I'll move to economy. Just don't destroy my father's company." Maya studied his face, seeing fear replace arrogance for the first time. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "your apology would have mattered 8 minutes ago. Now it's just damage control." She looked at Sophia Martinez, who stood watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Sophia, would you please prepare the cabin for departure? I believe Mr. Mitchell will be taking a different flight today." Brandon Mitchell's panic transformed into rage as the reality of his situation penetrated his privileged worldview. His face flushed crimson above his silk tie as he processed that the quiet black woman he had attempted to humiliate controlled his family's financial destiny. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cabin with enough volume to attract attention from economy class. "You can't destroy innocent people's lives over an airline seat." Maya remained seated, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Brandon's meltdown. She adjusted her simple black sweater and looked at him with the measured gaze of someone who had weathered far worse storms. "Mr. Mitchell," she said evenly, "nobody is destroying your life. You accomplished that yourself with 8 words, 'I don't sit next to people like you.'" Elizabeth Cross's voice continued to emanate from Maya's phone speaker as she coordinated the institutional response with surgical precision. "Maya, I've got the credit committee on an emergency conference call. They're reviewing the Mitchell Pharmaceuticals portfolio right now. How do you want us to characterize the acceleration trigger?" "Reputational risk," Maya replied without hesitation. The primary guarantor and his heir have demonstrated behavior that exposes the company to discrimination lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and consumer boycotts. Brandon's eyes widened as he processed the corporate speak. He had attended enough board meetings to understand that reputational risk was financial language for toxic association. "You're twisting one conversation into some kind of corporate crime," he protested, his voice breaking slightly. "This is personal. This isn't business." "Mr. Mitchell," Maya said, standing slowly to face him, "when you threatened this airline's cargo contracts to force them to remove me from my paid seat, you made it business. When you called me names and told me to know my place, you made it corporate policy. And when you did it in front of witnesses while being live-streamed to 28,000 viewers, you made it a public relations disaster." James Liu's viewer count had indeed climbed past 28,000 as word spread across social media platforms. Comments poured in faster than he could read them. "Brandon Mitchell is trending on Twitter. Someone find his LinkedIn. Mitchell Pharmaceutical's stock is falling. This is better than any movie." Patricia Williams, the gate supervisor, had been joined by 2 additional Skyline elite executives who emerged from the jet bridge looking like they were attending a funeral. The airline's reputation was collapsing in real time on social media. Captain Torres attempted to regain control of the situation that had spiraled far beyond his authority. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said carefully, "perhaps we could resolve this without involving the full corporate structure. Surely there's a middle ground that protects everyone's interests." Maya turned to face the captain with an expression that could have frozen jet fuel. "Captain Torres, exactly what middle ground would you suggest? Should Mr. Mitchell only be half racist? Should your airline only discriminate against passengers on alternate Tuesdays?" Sophia Martinez stepped forward from the galley, finding courage in Maya's unwavering stance against institutional compromise. Captain Sophia said, her voice stronger than she felt, "There is no middle ground for discrimination. Either we protect all passengers equally, or we don't deserve to wear these uniforms." Her words carried the weight of every service worker who had ever been forced to smile while absorbing abuse from entitled customers. Brandon pointed an accusatory finger at Sophia. "She doesn't get a vote. She's crew, not management." "She has the most important vote," Maya replied firmly. "She's the person you verbally assaulted for trying to do her job professionally." Elizabeth Cross's voice cut through the tension from Maya's phone. "Maya, I've got Harrison Mitchell's office calling our main line. Apparently someone told him about our position in his debt structure. He wants to negotiate." "Transfer him to my voicemail," Maya said without hesitation. "You won't even talk to my father?" Brandon asked desperately. "Mr. Mitchell, your father just spent the last hour using financial threats to force an airline to discriminate against a passenger. Why would I want to hear more from him?" The logical trap closed around Brandon like a cage. Every defense he offered only highlighted the magnitude of his family's institutional abuse. Robert Caldwell finally stood up from his seat in row 3. The elderly federal judge had remained silent through most of the confrontation, but his conscience wouldn't allow continued passivity. "Young man," he addressed Brandon directly, "I've spent 30 years on the federal bench. I've seen every kind of discrimination case you can imagine. What you did here today would result in a summary judgment against you in any courtroom in America." "Who asked you?" Old man Brandon snapped, his desperation making him even more reckless. "I'm not an old man," Robert replied calmly. "I'm Judge Robert Caldwell, United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida, retired. And if Dr. Rodriguez chooses to file a federal discrimination complaint, I would be happy to serve as a witness." The revelation that a federal judge had witnessed the entire confrontation sent another wave of panic through Brandon's system. Civil rights violations could result in criminal charges, not just financial consequences. Helen Caldwell stood beside her husband in a display of solidarity that had sustained their 50-year marriage. We both witnessed everything she said firmly. The threats, the name-calling, the attempts to force Dr. Rodriguez from her seat based on racial prejudice. James Liu's livestream audience exploded with comments as word spread that federal judicial authority was now involved. Federal judge confirmed it. This is officially a civil rights case. Brandon Mitchell is so fucked. Save this stream as evidence. Sofia Martinez looked around the cabin at the coalition of passengers and crew who had rallied to support Maya against institutional discrimination. For the first time in her aviation career, she felt proud of her job rather than ashamed of customer abuse. Dr. Rodriguez Sofia said formally on behalf of professional flight attendants everywhere, "Thank you for standing up to this behavior." Brandon's composure finally collapsed completely. The pharmaceutical heir, who had swaggered into first class demanding immediate service, now stood surrounded by witnesses to his discrimination facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges. "This is crazy," he shouted, his voice cracking. "All I wanted was a window seat. People switch seats all the time," Mr. Mitchell Maya said with devastating calm. "People switch seats voluntarily. You demanded that airline employees force me to move because you don't sit next to people like me. The distinction matters." Elizabeth Cross's voice provided the final blow from Maya's phone speaker. "Maya Harrison Mitchell just called personally. He's offering to settle any claims against his son in exchange for protecting the pharmaceutical debt structure. He's also threatening to have you arrested for extortion." Maya's laugh was genuinely amused. "Have me arrested by whom? For what? Apparently he's calling the FBI to report that you're using financial leverage to blackmail his family." "Perfect," Maya said. "I'll enjoy explaining to federal agents how calling in legally held debt constitutes blackmail." Mr. Mitchell seems unclear on the relationship between creditors and debtors. Brandon's last hope for family intervention evaporated as he realized his father's threats would only create additional legal exposure for criminal intimidation of witnesses. The cabin fell silent except for the hum of aircraft systems and the quiet murmur of James Liu's live-stream commentary. 30,000 viewers from around the world watched the final moments of the Mitchell family's pharmaceutical empire. Maya looked around the first-class cabin at the faces of passengers and crew who had been forced to choose sides in a confrontation none of them had anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying to every seat, "you've witnessed something important today. You've seen institutional discrimination challenged by institutional power. Mr. Mitchell believed his family's money made him untouchable. He was wrong." She turned to face Brandon directly. "Mr. Mitchell, you have 5 minutes to collect your belongings and leave this aircraft voluntarily. After that, you'll be removed by airport security." Brandon looked around the cabin, desperately searching for any source of support or sympathy. He found none. Even the passengers, who had initially remained neutral, now looked at him with disgust. The pharmaceutical heir, who had demanded immediate service, was about to learn that some mistakes carry permanent consequences. Captain David Torres felt the weight of 20 years of aviation experience colliding with institutional forces beyond his comprehension. His training had prepared him for mechanical emergencies, weather delays, and unruly passengers. Nothing had prepared him for watching a pharmaceutical empire collapse in his first-class cabin. "Dr. Rodriguez?" he said carefully, his voice carrying the authority of 4 gold stripes but lacking the confidence that usually accompanied them. "I need to understand the full scope of this situation. Are you asking me to remove a passenger from their assigned seat?" Maya adjusted her position in seat 1, making it clear she wasn't moving anywhere. Captain Torres, Mr. Mitchell, was never assigned to seat 1A. He was assigned to seat 2A, which remains available. He demanded that you force me to accept inferior service to accommodate his racial prejudices. I'm asking you to enforce your own airline's anti-discrimination policies. Elizabeth Cross's voice continued to coordinate the institutional response from Maya's phone. "Maya, I've got our legal team conferencing with the FAA's Office of Civil Rights. Apparently, forcing passengers to change seats based on discriminatory complaints creates federal regulatory liability for the airline. Torres felt sweat break out across his forehead. Federal regulatory liability meant FAA enforcement actions, possible fines, and potential loss of his airline transport pilot license. "Ma'am," he addressed Maya formally, "if you're alleging discrimination, we need to file an official report and involve federal authorities." Captain Brandon interjected desperately. "She's manipulating you. This woman is using financial threats to create false discrimination claims." Maya turned to face Brandon with an expression of clinical interest, like a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. "Mr. Mitchell, please explain how I manipulated you into saying I don't sit next to people like you in front of 35,000 live-stream viewers." James Liu held his phone higher, making sure his camera captured Brandon's response. The pharmaceutical heir looked like a cornered animal, dangerous in his desperation. "I never said that," Brandon shouted, but his protest lacked conviction. James Maya called to the tech blogger. "Could you please replay the beginning of your stream for Mr. Mitchell's benefit?" James scrolled back through his Instagram live footage and found the moment. Brandon's voice echoed through the cabin with crystal clarity. "Get out of my seat, now! I don't sit next to people like you." The playback silence was deafening. Even Brandon couldn't deny audio evidence of his own discrimination. Sophia Martinez stepped forward with her tablet, which had been recording the interaction for internal cabin safety documentation. "Captain," she said, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of the moment, "I have the complete interaction recorded on our internal safety system. It's automatically uploaded to corporate headquarters for review." Torres realized that Skyline Elite's own documentation system had captured evidence of institutional discrimination. There would be no covering up the incident or claiming it was a misunderstanding. Patricia Williams appeared again at the aircraft door this time, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Captain Torres, Patricia called. This is Robert Hawthorne, CEO of Skyline Elite Airways. He needs to speak with you immediately." The appearance of the airline's chief executive officer confirmed that the situation had escalated far beyond normal passenger complaint procedures. CEOs didn't personally respond to seating disputes unless institutional survival was at stake. Robert Hawthorne stepped into the first-class cabin, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. At 49, he had guided Skyline Elite through terrorist attacks, economic recessions, and pandemic shutdowns. But he had never faced the prospect of losing $847 million in financing because of passenger discrimination. Dr. Rodriguez Hawthorne said formally, "I'm Robert Hawthorne, CEO of Skyline Elite Airways. I need to apologize personally for this situation." "Mr. Hawthorne," Maya replied evenly, "your apology would be more meaningful if your airline hadn't spent the last hour trying to accommodate racial discrimination." Hawthorne looked at Captain Torres with the expression of a man deciding which employee to sacrifice to save the company. "Captain, I need a full report on your decision-making process regarding seat assignments." Torres felt the institutional machinery turning to crush him. 20 years of perfect safety records, spotless performance evaluations, and customer commendations were about to be erased by one compromised decision. Sir Torres said, his voice hollow, "Mr. Mitchell's father threatened our pharmaceutical shipping contracts if we didn't accommodate his son's seating preferences, and you interpreted financial threats as grounds to remove a paying passenger from her assigned seat." The question hung in the air like an indictment. Torres realized he had no defense that wouldn't confirm institutional discrimination. Elizabeth Cross's voice cut through the confrontation from Maya's phone. "Maya, Harrison Mitchell just called our board chairman directly. He's claiming you're orchestrating a conspiracy to destroy his family business over a personal grudge." "What did the chairman tell him?" Maya asked. "He told Mr. Mitchell that creditors don't need personal grudges to call in debt from companies that enable discrimination. He also suggested that Mr. Mitchell hire a bankruptcy attorney immediately. Brandon's face had gone completely pale as he processed that even board-level intervention couldn't save his family's empire. Robert Hawthorne looked at his airline's balance sheet calculations on his smartphone. $847 million in debt financing due Friday without Titan Capital's agreement to refinance. The airline couldn't survive the week if Maya Rodriguez chose institutional retaliation. Dr. Rodriguez Hawthorne said carefully, what would it take to resolve this situation constructively? Maya stood up from seat 1, drawing herself to her full height as she prepared to deliver institutional justice. Mr. Hawthorne, constructive resolution requires institutional accountability. Your captain ordered a paying passenger to accept inferior service to accommodate racial discrimination. Your gate supervisor participated in the discrimination. Your airline's policies enabled financial threats to override civil rights protections. She paused, looking around the cabin at every face watching the confrontation. Mr. Mitchell threatened your pharmaceutical contracts and your employees immediately capitulated to his demands. That reveals a corporate culture where money matters more than human dignity. Hawthorne felt the weight of $847 million in debt pressing down on his airline's future. What specific changes would demonstrate accountability, he asked. Captain Torres should be terminated immediately for discriminatory enforcement of seating policies, Maya said without hesitation. Patricia Williams should be fired for enabling discrimination, and Mr. Mitchell should be permanently banned from your airline for passenger abuse. Torres felt his career evaporating in real time. 20 years of professional aviation service ending because he had chosen financial pressure over moral courage. Dr. Rodriguez Torres said desperately, I made a mistake. I can learn from this. Please don't destroy my livelihood. Maya looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. Captain Torres, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to humiliate a passenger to protect corporate contracts. That choice has consequences. Elizabeth Cross provided the final crushing blow from Maya's phone. Maya, our credit committee just voted. We're calling the Mitchell Pharmaceuticals debt immediately. Harrison Mitchell has 12 hours to provide $700 million in cash or face involuntary bankruptcy proceedings. Brandon Mitchell's legs gave out. He collapsed into seat 2, his face buried in his hands as the magnitude of his family's destruction became clear. The pharmaceutical empire that had taken 3 generations to build was ending because a spoiled heir couldn't tolerate sitting 1 row behind a black woman. Maya Rodriguez ended the call with Elizabeth Cross and looked around the first-class cabin at the faces of passengers and crew who had just witnessed the systematic dismantling of a pharmaceutical empire. The silence was profound, broken only by the ambient hum of aircraft systems and the quiet sobbing of Brandon Mitchell. James Liu's Instagram live stream had passed 45,000 viewers as word spread across social media platforms that something extraordinary was happening on Skyline Elite Flight 445. Comments flooded in from around the world. She just bankrupted a bigot. This is the most savage thing I've ever seen. Titan Capital is savage. AF. Someone needs to make this into a movie. Sophia Martinez stood in the galley watching Maya with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The quiet woman who had asked about her feelings and requested sparkling water had just wielded institutional power like a surgical instrument cutting away discrimination with precision strikes to the financial foundation that enabled it. Robert Hawthorne, the CEO of Skyline Elite Airways, looked at his smartphone where his assistant had sent real-time updates on the airline's credit rating. 3 major agencies had already placed Skyline Elite on credit watch negative pending resolution of the Titan Capital financing dispute. Dr. Rodriguez Hawthorne said carefully, I need to understand your expectations for resolving this situation. My airline employs 12,000 people whose livelihoods depend on maintaining our credit facilities. Maya adjusted her simple black sweater and looked at the CEO with the calm authority of someone who controlled institutional destiny. "Mr. Hawthorne, your airline's survival depends on treating passengers with basic human dignity. Mr. Mitchell threatened your cargo contracts, and your employees immediately chose financial pressure over civil rights. That suggests a corporate culture problem that extends far beyond this cabin." She gestured toward Captain Torres, who stood frozen near the cockpit door like a man awaiting execution. Captain Torres had a choice. He could have enforced your own anti-discrimination policies, or he could have capitulated to financial threats. He chose capitulation. What does that tell you about your institutional priorities? Robert Caldwell, the retired federal judge, stood up from his seat in row 3. His 30 years on the bench had taught him to recognize institutional failure when he witnessed it. "Mr. Hawthorne," Judge Caldwell said formally, "I've observed the entire interaction. Your captain ordered a paying passenger to accept inferior service based solely on another passenger's racial prejudices and financial threats. That constitutes institutional discrimination under federal law. The presence of federal judicial authority transformed the situation from a customer service dispute into potential criminal liability." Hawthorne felt the legal machinery grinding into motion around his airline. Helen Caldwell stood beside her husband, adding the weight of 50 years of civil rights observation to the judicial testimony. "We both witnessed Mr. Mitchell's verbal assault on Dr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Martinez," she said firmly. "And we witnessed your airline's immediate capitulation to his family's financial threats." Patricia Williams, the gate supervisor, had remained silent during most of the confrontation, but the weight of institutional accountability finally forced her to speak. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said quietly, "Captain Torres called me when Mr. Mitchell's father threatened our pharmaceutical contracts. I told him to accommodate the request to protect our cargo revenue." The admission of premeditated discrimination sent another wave of shock through the cabin. Even Sophia Martinez, who had worked for the airline for 3 years, was surprised by the explicit acknowledgement of policy corruption. Brandon Mitchell finally raised his head from his hands. His face was streaked with tears, his expensive suit wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'll do anything. Just don't destroy my family." Maya looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Mitchell, your apology would have prevented this disaster 30 minutes ago. Now you're asking me to ignore institutional discrimination because you're facing consequences." She turned to address the entire cabin, her voice carrying to every passenger and crew member. "Everyone here has learned something important today. You've seen how privilege operates when it believes it's protected. Mr. Mitchell felt entitled to verbally assault passengers and crew because his family's money had always bought immunity from consequences." Elizabeth Cross's voice emerged from Maya's phone as she rejoined the conversation. "Maya, I've got updates on the institutional response. The NAACP is preparing a federal complaint against Skyline Elite for discriminatory practices. The Department of Transportation is opening a civil rights investigation, and CNN wants an exclusive interview about corporate-enabled discrimination." The mention of federal agencies and national media coverage sent Hawthorne into full crisis management mode. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said desperately, "surely we can resolve this through private negotiation rather than public litigation." "Mr. Hawthorne," Maya replied, "private negotiation is how discrimination gets covered up rather than corrected. Public accountability ensures institutional change." She looked at Sophia Martinez, who had stood courageously against passenger abuse despite her vulnerable position as junior crew. "Sophia, you demonstrated more integrity in 5 minutes than your management showed in 30. That deserves recognition, not punishment." Sophia felt tears threatening as she processed Maya's public validation of her professional courage. James Liu's live stream had become a global phenomenon. Viewer count approached 60,000 as the clip spread across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. News organizations were already reaching out for permission to broadcast segments of the stream. Maya pulled a business card from her wallet and handed it to Sophia. "Call me tomorrow," she said. "Titan Capital is always looking for people with real integrity." The gesture of offering employment to the flight attendant who had stood up to discrimination sent another message to everyone. Watching. Courage gets rewarded. Complicity gets punished. Captain Torres finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dr. Rodriguez, I've destroyed my career. I know that. But please, don't let my mistake hurt the other crew members who weren't involved." Maya studied his face, looking for genuine remorse rather than self-preservation. "Captain Torres, your mistake was choosing institutional pressure over moral courage. The question is whether you've learned from that choice or whether you're just sorry about the consequences." The distinction mattered. Institutional change required individual accountability, but it also required the possibility of redemption for people willing to genuinely reform their behavior. Elizabeth Cross provided the final institutional update from Maya's phone. Maya Harrison Mitchell's bankruptcy attorney just called. Mitchell Pharmaceuticals is filing for Chapter 11 protection this afternoon. They can't meet the debt obligations without our refinancing agreement. The pharmaceutical empire that had enabled Brandon's discrimination was officially collapsing. 3 generations of family wealth built on life-saving medications and maintained through political connections was ending because a spoiled heir couldn't tolerate diversity in first-class seating. Brandon Mitchell looked up at Maya with the hollow expression of someone watching his entire world disappear. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. "Destroying thousands of jobs because I said stupid things." Maya's response carried the weight of institutional justice. "Mr. Mitchell, you didn't just say stupid things. You used your family's financial power to force an airline to discriminate against a passenger. The thousands of jobs at your father's company are ending because your family built an empire on leveraged debt and used that empire to enable prejudice." She stood up from seat 1A, preparing to deliver the final judgment. "Actions have consequences, Mr. Mitchell. Today, you've learned that even pharmaceutical heirs face accountability when they abuse people who can't fight back." The cabin fell silent as everyone processed the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Institutional discrimination had met institutional justice, and the outcome was swift, decisive, and permanent. The first indication that the balance of power had shifted completely came from the cockpit, where First Officer Jennifer Walsh emerged with a tablet displaying urgent messages from Skyline Elite's operations center. "Captain Torres," she said, her voice tight with confusion, "we're getting priority alerts from headquarters. All Mitchell Pharmaceuticals shipping contracts have been suspended pending legal review." The pharmaceutical company's cargo relationship with Skyline Elite, which Brandon had used as leverage to force Maya from her seat, had evaporated within minutes of Maya's institutional response. Robert Hawthorne's phone buzzed with emergency alerts from his executive team. Skyline Elite's stock price was falling in after-hours trading as word spread through financial circles that Titan Capital was reviewing their airline investment. "Dr. Rodriguez Hawthorne," said, his voice carrying the desperation of a CEO watching his company's valuation collapse in real time. "I need to understand what would constitute adequate institutional response to this incident." Maya looked around the cabin at the passengers and crew who had witnessed institutional discrimination and its consequences. "Mr. Hawthorne, adequate response requires immediate termination of employees who enabled discrimination, permanent banning of passengers who abuse staff, and implemented policies that protect crew members from financial intimidation." She gestured toward Captain Torres and Patricia Williams. "These employees chose corporate pressure over civil rights. They cannot remain in positions where they might make the same choice again." Captain Torres felt 20 years of aviation career collapsing as the institutional machinery turned to sacrifice him for the airline's survival. "Doctor Rodriguez," he said desperately, "I have a mortgage, 2 kids in college, a pension that requires 25 years of service. Please don't destroy my family for one mistake." Maya's response carried no malice but absolute certainty. "Captain Torres, you didn't make one mistake. You made a series of calculated choices to prioritize financial pressure over passenger rights. Those choices have consequences." Patricia Williams stepped forward from the jet bridge, realizing that her career was ending regardless of what she said next. "Mr. Hawthorne," she announced, "I need to confess something. This isn't the first time we've accommodated discriminatory passenger requests to protect cargo contracts. We have informal policies about managing difficult situations when high-value clients make complaints." Her admission sent shockwaves through the cabin. Institutional discrimination wasn't an isolated incident, it was corporate policy disguised as customer service. James Liu's Instagram Live audience exploded with comments as the scope of airline complicity became clear. They have discrimination policies. This is way bigger than one racist passenger. Someone investigate all airlines. This is corporate racism. Judge Robert Caldwell processed Patricia's confession with the analytical precision of 3 decades on the federal bench. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said formally, "your gate supervisor just admitted to institutional discrimination policies. That constitutes a pattern of civil rights violations under federal law." The retired judge's confirmation that criminal liability extended beyond individual incidents to corporate policies sent Hawthorne into full damage control mode. Sofia Martinez looked at Maya with growing understanding of the forces that had been arranged against her throughout her aviation career. Dr. Rodriguez Sofia said quietly, "Now I understand why passengers like Mr. Mitchell always get their way. The airline has been enabling discrimination for years. Her revelation that crew members were aware of informal discrimination policies but powerless to resist them added another layer of institutional complicity to the investigation." Elizabeth Cross rejoined the conversation from Maya's phone with updates that transformed the incident from isolated discrimination to federal law enforcement priority. "Maya, the FBI's Civil Rights Division just called. They're opening a federal investigation into airline discrimination policies. Apparently, Patricia Williams's confession suggests RICO potential for institutional conspiracy. RICO charges would transform the situation from civil rights violation to organized crime investigation. Airlines that participated in coordinated discrimination policies could face federal conspiracy charges." Brandon Mitchell finally processed that his discrimination had triggered federal criminal investigation of multiple airlines. "This is insane," he whispered, his voice hollow with shock. "All I wanted was a window seat. How did this become a federal case?" Maya looked at him with something approaching pity. "Mr. Mitchell, you didn't just want a window seat. You wanted validation that your family's money could force strangers to accept humiliation. Federal cases happen when individual prejudice meets institutional enabling." Robert Hawthorne received another emergency alert from his legal team. 3 separate federal agencies were now investigating Skyline Elite's passenger accommodation policies. "Dr. Rodriguez, he said my airline is facing potential criminal charges because of policies we inherited from previous management. Surely there's room for cooperation rather than destruction." Maya stood up from seat 1, drawing herself to her full height as she prepared to deliver institutional judgment. "Mr. Hawthorne, cooperation requires accountability. Your airline enabled discrimination for years. Your employees immediately capitulated to financial threats. Your policies prioritized cargo revenue over passenger rights." She looked around the cabin at everyone who had witnessed the institutional response to prejudice. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen something unprecedented today. You've watched institutional discrimination meet institutional accountability. Mr. Mitchell believed his family's money made him untouchable. He was wrong. The pharmaceutical heir who had demanded immediate service was about to learn that some mistakes trigger permanent consequences that money cannot fix. Airport security arrived at Gate A-12 in formation. 4 officers led by Sergeant Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of Miami International's police force. Behind them walked FBI Special Agent David Chen, whose presence elevated the situation from airline discrimination to federal civil rights investigation. Brandon Mitchell looked up from Seat 2A, where he had collapsed after watching his family's pharmaceutical empire crumble in real time. His expensive Armani suit was wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his face streaked with tears of panic and disbelief. "Mr. Mitchell," Sergeant Santos said formally, "we need you to step off the aircraft for questioning regarding passenger interference and discriminatory conduct." The announcement that federal authorities were removing Brandon from the plane sent James Liu's Instagram live viewership past 75,000 as word spread across social media that criminal charges were imminent. "This is harassment," Brandon protested, but his voice lacked the entitled confidence he had displayed 30 minutes earlier. "I'm the victim here. That woman used financial terrorism to destroy my family." Special Agent Chen stepped forward, his federal credentials visible on his belt. At 42, he had investigated dozens of civil rights cases and recognized institutional discrimination when he witnessed it developing. "Mr. Mitchell," Agent Chen said calmly, "we have video evidence of you verbally assaulting passengers and crew members, threatening financial retaliation against the airline, and demanding discriminatory removal of a passenger from her paid seat. Those actions constitute federal crimes." Maya Rodriguez remained seated in 1A, watching the institutional machinery of justice engage Brandon Mitchell's criminal behavior. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding her. Robert Hawthorne, the CEO of Skyline Elite Airways, realized his airline was about to become the subject of federal criminal investigation. 12,000 employees, hundreds of aircraft, and decades of corporate reputation were collapsing because his crew had enabled passenger discrimination. Agent Chen Hawthorne said desperately, "Skyline Elite Airways is fully cooperating with your investigation. We've already terminated the employees who enabled discriminatory conduct." "Mr. Hawthorne." Agent Chen replied, "Terminating employees doesn't address the institutional policies that encouraged discrimination in the first place. We're investigating whether your airline engaged in a pattern of civil rights violations." Captain David Torres felt the weight of federal law enforcement focusing on his decision to remove Maya from her seat. 20 years of perfect safety records and spotless performance evaluations were about to be erased by one moment of moral cowardice. Agent Chen Torres said quietly, "I made a terrible mistake. I chose financial pressure over passenger rights. I'm willing to testify about the institutional pressures that led to my decision." His offer to cooperate with federal investigation represented a last desperate attempt to salvage something from his destroyed career. Sophia Martinez watched Brandon being escorted off the aircraft by federal agents and felt a mixture of justice and sadness. The young flight attendant had stood up to passenger abuse despite her vulnerable position, and now she was witnessing the full institutional response to discrimination. Dr. Rodriguez Sophia said quietly, "Thank you for showing me that courage gets protected when you have the power to protect it." Maya looked at the young woman who had demonstrated integrity under pressure. "Sophia, you showed courage before you knew I had any power to protect you. That's the kind of character that deserves advancement." Elizabeth Cross's voice emerged from Maya's phone with updates that confirmed the scope of institutional response. "Maya, the Department of Transportation is opening a comprehensive investigation of airline discrimination policies. The NAACP is filing federal complaints against 3 major carriers, and the Senate Commerce Committee wants hearings on civil rights in aviation. The revelation that congressional attention was focusing on airline discrimination transformed the incident from isolated misconduct to potential industry-wide reform." Judge Robert Caldwell stood up from his seat in row 3, adding the weight of federal judicial authority to the investigation. Agent Chen. Judge Caldwell said formally, "I'm Robert Caldwell, United States District Judge for the Southern District of Florida, retired. I witnessed the entire interaction, including explicit threats by Mr. Mitchell's father to use financial leverage against this airline unless they removed Dr. Rodriguez from her seat." The federal judge's testimony that pharmaceutical executives had threatened airline cargo contracts to force passenger discrimination elevated the investigation to potential RICO conspiracy charges. Brandon Mitchell was escorted down the jet bridge in handcuffs, his entitled worldview shattered by the reality of federal criminal liability. The pharmaceutical heir who had demanded immediate service was learning that institutional accountability could move faster than family wealth. "This isn't over," Brandon shouted as the officers led him away. "My father has connections. You can't destroy us over political correctness." His final outburst, captured by James Liu's live stream and dozens of passenger phones, became an instant viral sensation, demonstrating the mindset that had enabled decades of discrimination. Patricia Williams, the gate supervisor who had admitted to informal discrimination policies, was also escorted away by federal agents for questioning about institutional civil rights violations. Mr. Hawthorne. Agent Chen said, "We're seizing all documents related to Skyline Elite's passenger accommodation policies, cargo contract negotiations, and crew training materials. Your airline is under federal investigation." The seizure of corporate documents confirmed that the discrimination investigation extended far beyond Brandon Mitchell's individual conduct to the institutional policies that had enabled it. Maya stood up from seat 1A as federal agents secured the crime scene. Her quiet dignity throughout the confrontation had triggered an institutional response that would reshape airline industry policies. Agent Chen Maya said formally, "Titan, Capital Holdings will provide complete cooperation with your investigation, including documentation of financial threats made by Mitchell Pharmaceuticals executives." Her offer to provide institutional evidence against the pharmaceutical company that had threatened airline contracts ensured that federal investigation would pursue criminal charges against multiple parties. James Liu's Instagram live stream had become the most watched aviation incident in social media history. Comments poured in from around the world as word spread that institutional discrimination was finally facing institutional accountability. "She destroyed a pharmaceutical empire. This is the most savage justice I've ever seen. Brandon Mitchell arrested for racism. FBI investigating airline discrimination." Sophia Martinez looked around the empty first-class cabin where institutional justice had played out in real time. The quiet woman who had requested sparkling water had systematically dismantled a culture of discrimination with surgical precision. Dr. Rodriguez Sophia said with genuine admiration, "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for every passenger and crew member who's ever faced discrimination." Maya collected her book and simple black sweater, preparing to leave the aircraft that had become the site of historic civil rights accountability. "Sophia," she said gently, "institutional change requires individual courage. You showed that courage when it mattered most." The first-class cabin of Skyline Elite Flight 445 fell silent except for the ambient hum of aircraft systems. Institutional discrimination had met institutional justice, and the outcome was swift, decisive, and permanent. Federal criminal investigation would ensure that airline discrimination faced consequences that money couldn't purchase or influence couldn't corrupt. Within 6 hours of Maya Rodriguez's phone call to Elizabeth Cross, the institutional response to discrimination had metastasized through corporate boardrooms across 3 continents. Emergency meetings convened in New York, London, and Frankfurt as financial institutions calculated their exposure to companies that enabled civil rights violations. Robert Hawthorne sat in Skyline Elite's Crisis Management Center, watching his airline's stock price collapse in after-hours trading. The company's market capitalization had fallen by $2 billion as investors processed that Titan Capital was reviewing their debt relationship. "Sir," announced Sarah Kim, Skyline Elite's chief legal officer, "the Department of Transportation has issued an emergency order suspending our passenger accommodation policies pending federal review. We are prohibited from making any seating changes based on passenger complaints until the investigation concludes." The federal intervention meant that Skyline Elite could no longer prioritize high-value customers over civil rights, even when cargo contracts worth millions of dollars were threatened. Captain David Torres received his termination notice via email while still standing on the jet bridge. 20 years of perfect safety records, spotless performance evaluations, and customer commendations were erased by one decision to prioritize financial pressure over moral courage. Effective immediately, the email read, "Your employment with Skyline Elite Airways is terminated for violation of federal anti-discrimination policies. Your pilot's license status will be reviewed by the FAA for potential certificate action." Torres felt his pension, his family's health insurance, and his children's college tuition disappearing as the institutional machinery ground his career to dust. Patricia Williams, the gate supervisor who had admitted to informal discrimination policies, faced criminal charges in addition to termination. FBI agents had seized her corporate communications, revealing years of instructions to accommodate discriminatory passenger requests when cargo contracts were at stake. Ms. Williams announced federal prosecutor Janet Morrison, "You're being charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law. Your cooperation with the investigation will be considered during sentencing negotiations." The transformation of employment termination into criminal prosecution sent shockwaves through airline management at carriers across the industry. Sophia Martinez received a phone call that would change her life trajectory permanently. Sophia said, "Maya Rodriguez's voice, this is Dr. Rodriguez from Titan Capital. Are you interested in joining our corporate ethics and compliance division? Starting salary is $120,000 plus equity participation." The flight attendant, who had stood up to passenger abuse despite her vulnerable position, was being offered a salary that tripled her airline income. Dr. Rodriguez Sophia said, tears flowing freely. "Yes. Absolutely yes. Excellent. Report to our Manhattan office Monday morning. You're going to help us identify and prevent institutional discrimination across our portfolio companies." The transformation of Sophia's career from service worker to corporate ethics officer demonstrated that courage in the face of prejudice could trigger upward mobility that traditional aviation hierarchy would never provide. Elizabeth Cross called an emergency meeting of Titan Capital's investment committee to address the Mitchell Pharmaceutical's bankruptcy and its implications for healthcare sector investments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elizabeth announced to the room of portfolio managers, "Harrison Mitchell's pharmaceutical empire is filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy this afternoon. We're accelerating debt collection across all Mitchell-related entities. The deliberate destruction of the pharmaceutical fortune that had enabled Brandon's discrimination sent a message throughout the private equity industry enabling prejudice carried institutional consequences that family wealth couldn't survive. James Liu's Instagram live stream had generated over 200 million views across all platforms as news organizations picked up the story of airline discrimination meeting institutional accountability. His documentation of the confrontation had become the most watched civil rights incident in social media history. CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox News, BBC, and Al Jazeera have all requested exclusive interviews, announced his agent via text message. This footage is worth at least 7 figures in licensing fees. The tech blogger who had accidentally documented institutional discrimination was about to become financially independent from viral content that exposed corporate complicity and civil rights violations. Robert Caldwell received a call from the Department of Justice requesting his testimony in the federal investigation of airline discrimination policies. Judge Caldwell said Assistant Attorney General Maria Santos We're investigating whether multiple airlines conspired to prioritize cargo contracts over passenger civil rights. Your testimony about institutional pressure could be crucial to establishing criminal conspiracy charges. The retired federal judge's witness testimony was transforming the investigation from individual misconduct to industry-wide criminal conspiracy. Helen Caldwell started a social media campaign that went viral within hours, #NeverSilentAgain, encouraging passengers to document and report discrimination rather than remaining passive witnesses. Silence enables discrimination, she posted on Twitter. Every person who witnesses prejudice and does nothing becomes complicit in institutional injustice. Her activism, sparked by watching Maya's courage in the face of discrimination, generated over 2 million retweets and inspired similar movements in Europe and Asia. Dr. Maya Rodriguez received calls from congressional offices, civil rights organizations, and international human rights groups requesting her participation in reform initiatives. Dr. Rodriguez announced Senator Patricia Johnson's office, the Senate Commerce Committee, is scheduling hearings on discrimination in transportation. Your testimony about institutional enabling of prejudice would be invaluable to our investigation. Maya's quiet dignity in the face of discrimination had positioned her as a leading voice for civil rights reform in corporate America. Harrison Mitchell's pharmaceutical empire officially collapsed at 4:47 p.m. Eastern Time when bankruptcy courts accepted Mitchell Pharmaceutical's Chapter 11 filing. 3 generations of family wealth built on life-saving medications and maintained through political connections ended because institutional accountability finally exceeded financial influence. The Mitchell family fortune is estimated at negative $2.3 billion, announced financial analyst Rebecca Torres on CNN. This represents the fastest destruction of pharmaceutical wealth in corporate history. Brandon Mitchell sat in a Miami federal detention facility, facing charges that could result in 5 years in federal prison. The pharmaceutical heir, who had demanded immediate service, was learning that criminal prosecution moved faster than family influence. His cellmate, convicted of tax evasion, listened to Brandon's story with growing amazement. "You mean you destroyed your entire family fortune because you didn't want to sit behind a black lady on an airplane?" The question highlighted the absolute stupidity of the prejudice that had triggered institutional catastrophe. Skyline Elite Airways stock closed down 47%, as investors calculated that federal civil rights investigations could result in criminal charges against multiple airline executives. The company's survival depended entirely on Maya Rodriguez's willingness to prevent institutional destruction. Dr. Rodriguez Robert Hawthorne pleaded during a conference call with federal mediators, 12,000 employees will lose their jobs if Titan Capital withdraws financing. Surely institutional reform can happen without institutional destruction. Maya's response would determine whether airline industry discrimination faced correction or annihilation. The Mitchell family's pharmaceutical empire, built over 3 generations and worth approximately $2.1 billion, collapsed completely within 18 hours of Brandon's discrimination against Maya Rodriguez. The speed of institutional destruction served as a stark reminder that leveraged wealth could evaporate faster than family reputations could recover. Harrison Mitchell sat in his corner office at Mitchell Pharmaceutical's headquarters, watching federal agents seize corporate documents related to airline cargo contracts and discriminatory passenger complaints. The 60-year-old pharmaceutical mogul who had threatened Skyline Elite's shipping relationship was learning that institutional retaliation could be swift and absolute. Mr. Mitchell announced FBI Special Agent Lisa Wong, "You're under investigation for conspiracy to violate civil rights through financial intimidation. Your recorded phone conversation threatening airline contracts constitutes federal evidence of institutional discrimination." The transformation of Harrison's business threats into criminal evidence demonstrated that even pharmaceutical executives faced accountability when their financial leverage enabled prejudice. "This is insane," Harrison protested, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I was protecting my son's medical accommodation needs." Mr. Mitchell. Agent Wong replied coldly, "Your son admitted on live stream that he doesn't sit next to people like Dr. Rodriguez. Medical accommodation doesn't include racial segregation." The FBI's rejection of Harrison's fabricated medical justification eliminated his last defense against criminal liability for enabling discrimination. Brandon Mitchell's federal detention hearing revealed the scope of charges he faced for passenger interference, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to commit discrimination through financial threats. Mr. Mitchell announced federal judge Maria Santos, "You're charged with interference with flight crew operations, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and financial intimidation of transportation workers. Bail is set at $5 million. The pharmaceutical heir who had demanded immediate first-class service was facing potential federal prison time that family wealth could no longer prevent. "Your Honor," protested Brandon's attorney, "my client is financially ruined. His family's assets have been frozen by creditor action. $5 million bail is impossible." Mr. Mitchell chose to threaten an airline's cargo contracts to force discrimination against a passenger. Judge Santos replied, "The consequences of that choice include pretrial detention." Brandon's discovery that federal judges wouldn't accommodate his financial manipulation marked the complete end of pharmaceutical privilege in the American legal system. Mitchell Pharmaceuticals' board of directors convened an emergency meeting to address the company's bankruptcy filing and federal criminal investigation. The pharmaceutical patents that had generated billions in revenue were being sold to satisfy Titan Capital's debt acceleration. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced board chairman Robert Hayes, "we have no choice but to liquidate all assets to satisfy creditor demands. Mitchell Pharmaceuticals will cease operations within 30 days. The dissolution of the pharmaceutical company eliminated 4,000 jobs, but it also ensured that life-saving medications would be produced by companies without histories of enabling discrimination. Harrison Mitchell's personal assets, including the family estate in Connecticut, the yacht in the Hamptons, and the private jet, were seized by federal marshals to satisfy bankruptcy obligations that exceeded his liquid wealth. Mr. Mitchell announced bankruptcy trustee David Kim, "Your personal guarantee on pharmaceutical debt totals $600 million. All non-essential assets will be liquidated to satisfy creditor claims." The transformation of Harrison from pharmaceutical mogul to bankrupt defendant illustrated that institutional accountability could destroy even generational wealth when moral failures triggered financial consequences. Local news coverage of the Mitchell family's collapse revealed the scope of their fall from pharmaceutical royalty to federal custody. Harrison Mitchell, once worth over $2 billion, was seen this morning moving into a studio apartment in Newark, New Jersey. His son Brandon remains in federal custody, facing civil rights charges that could result in 5 years in prison. The visible poverty of former pharmaceutical aristocrats served as a powerful deterrent to other wealthy families who might consider using financial leverage to enable discrimination. Maya Rodriguez received daily updates on the Mitchell family's destruction from Elizabeth Cross, who coordinated Titan Capital's institutional response to ensure complete financial accountability. Maya Elizabeth reported Harrison Mitchell's bankruptcy attorney requested a meeting to discuss potential cooperation with federal investigators. Apparently, he's willing to testify about industry-wide discrimination policies in exchange for reduced criminal exposure. The prospect of Harrison testifying against other pharmaceutical and airline executives suggested that Brandon's individual prejudice had triggered investigations that could reshape multiple industries. Elizabeth Maya replied, "Institutional accountability requires institutional consequences. The Mitchell family's cooperation doesn't eliminate their moral responsibility for enabling decades of discrimination." Her refusal to accept bankruptcy as sufficient punishment ensured that criminal prosecution would proceed regardless of financial cooperation. Social media coverage of the Mitchell family's collapse generated millions of comments celebrating the institutional response to discrimination. Brandon Mitchell destroyed his entire family. This is what happens when racism meets reality. Never threaten Titan capital. Pharmaceutical privilege finally ends. The viral celebration of the Mitchells' destruction served as cultural confirmation that institutional discrimination no longer enjoyed public tolerance or protection. Brandon's former Harvard Business School classmates distanced themselves completely from association with pharmaceutical discrimination. We're establishing a scholarship fund for civil rights education, announced the Harvard Alumni Association. Brandon Mitchell's conduct represents everything our institution opposes. The academic rejection of Brandon's prejudice ensured that even elite educational networks wouldn't protect wealthy alumni who enabled discrimination. Harrison Mitchell's final phone call to Maya Rodriguez represented a last, desperate attempt to salvage something from his family's institutional destruction. "Dr. Rodriguez, please. I'm willing to pay whatever compensation you demand. Just don't let my son go to federal prison for one moment of stupidity." Maya's response carried the weight of institutional justice. "Mr. Mitchell, your son's stupidity destroyed my dignity, Sophia's safety, and your family's fortune. Federal prison is where people learn that prejudice carries permanent consequences." The finality of Maya's rejection ensured that Mitchell family wealth, pharmaceutical influence, and social connections couldn't purchase immunity from the criminal liability that discrimination had triggered. By sunset on February 16th, exactly 24 hours after Brandon had demanded Maya's first-class seat, the Mitchell family pharmaceutical empire existed only as a bankruptcy case study and federal criminal investigation. 3 generations of wealth destroyed by 8 words, "I don't sit next to people like you." 6 months after Maya Rodriguez's institutional response to discrimination transformed Skyline Elite Airways from complicit enabler to civil rights leader, the airline industry had implemented the most comprehensive anti-discrimination policies in transportation history. Robert Hawthorne stood in the renovated training center at Skyline Elite's Miami headquarters, watching newly hired crew members complete mandatory civil rights education that Maya had personally designed. The CEO, who had nearly lost his airline to federal investigation, was now leading industry-wide reform. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hawthorne addressed the training class, "you're learning the Rodriguez Protocol, named after Dr. Maya Rodriguez, who taught us that customer service never includes accommodating prejudice." The transformation of Maya's surname into official airline policy ensured that her courage would be institutionalized across the aviation industry for generations. Sophia Martinez, now Director of Passenger Rights and Corporate Ethics for Skyline Elite, conducted the advanced training session on recognizing and responding to discrimination attempts. When passengers use financial threats, social pressure, or claimed medical needs to force discriminatory seating changes, Sophia explained to the class, "You have absolute authority to refuse those requests and remove abusive passengers from aircraft." Her promotion from vulnerable flight attendant to executive authority demonstrated that standing up to discrimination could accelerate career advancement faster than traditional airline hierarchy. The Rodriguez Protocol had been adopted by 12 major airlines after federal aviation authorities made anti-discrimination training mandatory for all passenger service employees. Crew members are now protected by federal whistleblower statutes, announced FAA Administrator Janet Kim during a press conference. Any employee who reports discrimination receives immediate protection from retaliation, plus financial incentives for exposing civil rights violations. The federal policy transformation ensured that airline employees would be rewarded rather than punished for refusing to accommodate prejudice. James Liu's documentation of institutional discrimination had generated over 500 million views across all platforms, creating a new genre of social justice content that exposed corporate complicity in real time. The airline discrimination footage has been used in civil rights education programs at Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, and Stanford, announced his literary agent. Universities are paying licensing fees to include the footage in discrimination awareness curriculum. the academic adoption of James's live stream ensured that future business leaders would study the Mitchell family's destruction as a case study in how prejudice triggers institutional consequences. Judge Robert Caldwell had been invited to speak at international human rights conferences about the importance of witness testimony in civil rights violations. Discrimination flourishes when good people remain silent, he told audiences in London, Paris, and Geneva. Dr. Rodriguez's courage inspired institutional accountability, but witness testimony provided the legal foundation for criminal prosecution. His international speaking engagements spread awareness that civil rights violations required active intervention rather than passive observation. Helen Caldwell's #NeverSilentAgain social media campaign had generated over 50 million posts documenting discrimination incidents across multiple industries. Passengers are now recording discrimination attempts instead of ignoring them, she announced during a congressional hearing on transportation civil rights. Social media has become a powerful tool for exposing institutional prejudice. The cultural shift from silent witnessing to active documentation ensured that discrimination attempts would face immediate public accountability. Dr. Maya Rodriguez had been appointed to the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Advisory Committee, where she developed policies that extended anti-discrimination protections across all forms of commercial transportation. Institutional discrimination requires institutional solutions, she testified before Congress. Individual prejudice becomes corporate liability when companies enable, rather than prevent, civil rights violations. Her policy expertise gained through dismantling the Mitchell pharmaceutical empire now shaped federal regulation that protected millions of travelers from discrimination. Elizabeth Cross announced that Titan Capital had established a $100 million fund to finance civil rights litigation against companies that enabled discrimination. Corporate accountability requires financial consequences, she explained during a Wall Street Journal interview. Companies that prioritize prejudice over principles will face institutional retaliation from institutional investors. The creation of financial weapons specifically designed to punish discrimination ensured that corporate civil rights violations would trigger immediate economic consequences. Skyline Elite Airways had achieved the highest customer satisfaction ratings in airline history after implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. Revenue increased 40% year over year after we eliminated discriminatory passenger accommodation, Hawthorne announced during the company's annual shareholder meeting. Decent people prefer flying with airlines that protect passenger dignity. The financial success of civil rights leadership demonstrated that moral courage generated better business results than discriminatory customer service. The Mitchell Pharmaceuticals bankruptcy had been completed with all assets liquidated to satisfy creditor claims and civil rights settlement obligations. The Mitchell family fortune has been distributed to civil rights organizations and discrimination victims, announced bankruptcy trustee David Kim. This represents the largest civil rights settlement in pharmaceutical industry history. The transformation of pharmaceutical wealth into civil rights funding ensured that the Mitchell family's discrimination had generated permanent institutional benefits for future discrimination victims. Brandon Mitchell remained in federal prison serving a 3-year sentence for civil rights violations and passenger interference charges. Inmate Mitchell works in the prison laundry facility, reported Federal Corrections Officer Maria Santos. He's required to attend weekly diversity education sessions as part of his rehabilitation program. The pharmaceutical heir who had demanded immediate first-class service was learning humility through manual labor and mandatory civil rights education. Sophia Martinez concluded each training session with a personal message that had become legendary among airline employees. Dr. Maya Rodriguez taught me that courage doesn't require power. It creates power. Every time you stand up to discrimination, you make the aviation industry safer for everyone who comes after you. Her words ensured that Maya's legacy would inspire generations of transportation workers to choose moral courage over institutional pressure. The airline industry had been permanently transformed from a culture that accommodated discrimination to one that aggressively prevented it all because one quiet woman in seat 1A refused to accept that her dignity was negotiable. Dr. Maya Rodriguez walked through the gleaming corridors of London Heathrow Airport beside Sophia Martinez, who now carried herself with the confidence of someone whose moral courage had been rewarded with institutional authority. Both women wore simple business attire, Maya in her characteristic black sweater and dark slacks, Sophia in a tailored blazer that announced her executive status. They were returning from a European Union conference on transportation civil rights, where Maya had presented the Rodriguez Protocol to aviation ministers from 27 countries. The anti-discrimination framework that began with one phone call on Flight 445 was becoming international law. Dr. Rodriguez Sophia said as they approached the Skyline Elite gate, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't fought back that day?" Maya paused at the boarding area, looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the aircraft that would carry them home to Miami. 6 months earlier, this same airline had tried to force her from her seat to accommodate racial prejudice. Today, Skyline Elite led the industry in civil rights protection. Sophia Maya replied thoughtfully, "Institutional discrimination survives when good people accept that fighting back isn't worth the effort." Brandon Mitchell believed I would quietly move to business class rather than challenge his prejudice. They approached the gate agent, who recognized Maya immediately. Every Skyline Elite employee had completed mandatory training on the discrimination incident that had nearly destroyed the company. Dr. Rodriguez, the agent, said warmly, "Welcome back. Your seats in first class are ready, and the captain has asked to speak with you personally before departure." The transformation of Maya from unwanted passenger to honored guest demonstrated how institutional accountability could reshape corporate culture within months. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had replaced the terminated David Torres, emerged from the jet bridge to greet Maya personally. At 42, she was Skyline Elite's first female captain, promoted specifically for her commitment to civil rights enforcement. Dr. Rodriguez. Captain Walsh said formally, "It's an honor to have you aboard. I want you to know that this aircraft operates under strict Rodriguez Protocol guidelines. No passenger will ever be moved from their paid seat to accommodate another passenger's prejudice." The captain's personal commitment to anti-discrimination policies ensured that airline crews understood civil rights protection as their primary responsibility. Maya and Sophia boarded Flight 447, the same route that had witnessed institutional discrimination 6 months earlier. The first-class cabin had been redesigned with civil rights education materials integrated into passenger entertainment systems. Passengers can now access complete documentation of discrimination prevention. Policies explained led flight attendant Carlos Rivera as he showed them to their seats. "We want travelers to understand their civil rights protections." Sophia took seat 1B, while Maya settled into her familiar 1A. The symbolic importance of her return to the scene of institutional transformation wasn't lost on either woman. "It feels different now," Sophia observed, looking around the cabin where she had once served as a vulnerable flight attendant. 6 months ago, I was terrified that standing up to Brandon Mitchell would cost me my job. Now, standing up to discrimination is your job, Maya noted with satisfaction. The passenger manifest for Flight 447 included several notable travelers who had specifically chosen Skyline Elite because of its anti-discrimination reputation. Judge Robert and Helen Caldwell occupied seats 3A and 3B, returning from a human rights conference in Geneva, where they had testified about the importance of witness intervention. James Liu sat in 2C, completing a documentary about institutional discrimination that had been purchased by Netflix for global distribution. His accidental live stream had evolved into a comprehensive examination of corporate complicity in civil rights violations. Dr. Rodriguez James said, turning to acknowledge her presence. The documentary premieres next month at the Cannes Film Festival. Would you consider attending the screening? The transformation of airline discrimination into international cinematic education ensured that Maya's courage would reach global audiences. As Flight 447 pushed back from the gate, Maya received a text message from Elizabeth Cross, providing updates on the institutional consequences that continued to cascade from Brandon Mitchell's discrimination. Maya. The message read, Harrison Mitchell testified before Congress today about pharmaceutical industry discrimination policies. His cooperation has triggered investigations into 12 other companies that used financial leverage to enable prejudice. The ongoing federal investigation suggested that Brandon's individual racism had exposed industry-wide complicity that would take years to fully prosecute. Sophia opened her laptop to review civil rights training materials she was developing for international aviation organizations. Her expertise gained through surviving discrimination and designing institutional responses was now being exported globally. I received requests from British Airways, Air France, Lufthansa, and Japan Airlines to implement Rodriguez protocol training for their crews, she told Maya. Civil rights education is becoming mandatory worldwide. The international adoption of Maya's discrimination prevention framework ensured that airline prejudice would face institutional consequences across all major carriers. Captain Walsh's voice came over the intercom as Flight 447 reached cruising altitude. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Skyline Elite, Flight 447. As always, our crew is committed to ensuring every passenger receives equal treatment regardless of race, religion, nationality, or economic status. Discrimination has no place at 38,000 feet. The captain's announcement, now standard on all Skyline Elite flights, served as public confirmation that civil rights protection was corporate policy rather than individual discretion. Maya looked out the window at the Atlantic Ocean below, remembering the moment 6 months earlier when she had made the phone call that destroyed a pharmaceutical empire and transformed airline industry culture. Sophia, she said quietly, institutional change requires individual courage, but it also requires individual consequences. Brandon Mitchell's prejudice triggered permanent transformation because the consequences were severe enough to deter future discrimination. The lesson of proportional response that discrimination had to face destruction rather than inconvenience was being studied in business schools as a model for civil rights enforcement. Their flight progressed smoothly across the Atlantic, with crew members periodically checking on passenger comfort in ways that emphasized equal service rather than preferential treatment for wealthy travelers. As they began descent into Miami International Airport, Maya reflected on how quickly institutional discrimination could be eliminated when corporate survival depended on civil rights compliance. The airline industry changed permanently in 6 months, she told Sophia, because financial consequences moved faster than cultural evolution. Flight 447 landed at Miami International at sunset, completing a journey that symbolized the transformation from discrimination to justice in commercial aviation. The institutional transformation that began with Maya Rodriguez's phone call to Elizabeth Cross had spread far beyond airline discrimination to reshape corporate civil rights enforcement across multiple industries. Federal agencies armed with new regulatory authority and financial tools were now dismantling institutional discrimination that had operated unchallenged for decades. The Department of Transportation published comprehensive data 6 months after the Skyline Elite incident, demonstrating the scope of civil rights transformation. Discrimination complaints in commercial aviation have decreased by 87% since implementation of the Rodriguez Protocol, announced Transportation Secretary Linda Martinez during a press briefing. More importantly, crew member reports of passenger abuse have declined by 92%, indicating that discrimination prevention policies are working. The statistical validation that institutional accountability prevented prejudice more effectively than complaint procedures after the fact provided evidence that proactive civil rights enforcement generated better results than reactive punishment. The Federal Aviation Administration had created a new Office of Civil Rights Enforcement staffed by investigators specifically trained to identify and prosecute transportation discrimination. We've initiated federal investigations into 43 airlines, 12 cruise lines, and 27 bus companies based on discrimination patterns identified through passenger reports, announced FAA Civil Rights Director Maria Santos. Corporate enabling of prejudice is now treated as federal criminal activity. The expansion of civil rights enforcement beyond airlines ensured that all forms of commercial transportation would face institutional accountability for enabling discrimination. Congress had passed the Rodriguez Civil Rights Protection Act, establishing federal penalties for companies that accommodated discriminatory customer requests through financial intimidation or policy manipulation. Institutional discrimination will now trigger automatic civil rights investigations, criminal referrals, and financial penalties up to 10% of corporate revenue, announced Senator Patricia Johnson during the bill's signing ceremony. The Mitchell family's destruction demonstrates that civil rights violations carry permanent consequences. The legislative codification of Maya's institutional response ensured that future discrimination would face federal prosecution rather than corporate accommodation. Private equity firms had adopted Titan Capital's model of using financial leverage to enforce civil rights compliance across portfolio companies. We've required all investment targets to implement Rodriguez Protocol training as a condition of funding, announced Blackstone CEO David Kim. Companies that enable discrimination represent unacceptable reputational and legal risk for institutional investors. The adoption of civil rights enforcement as investment criteria meant that corporate access to capital now depended on demonstrable anti-discrimination policies. International human rights organizations had incorporated the Rodriguez Protocol into global civil rights frameworks. Dr. Rodriguez's institutional response to airline discrimination has become a model for civil rights enforcement in Europe. Asia and Latin America announced United Nations Human Rights Commissioner Elena Torres. Individual courage combined with institutional accountability creates lasting social change. The global adoption of Maya's discrimination prevention model ensured that civil rights protection would expand beyond American transportation to international commercial interactions. Law schools had integrated the Mitchell family destruction into civil rights curriculum as a case study demonstrating how financial leverage could serve justice rather than enable prejudice. The speed and completeness of institutional consequences for discrimination provides a template for civil rights enforcement that traditional litigation cannot match, explained Harvard law professor Robert Hayes. Students learn that moral courage combined with financial authority can achieve justice more effectively than decades of court proceedings. The academic study of Maya's institutional response ensured that future lawyers would understand civil rights enforcement as immediate rather than delayed justice. Social media platforms had implemented discrimination reporting systems that connected civil rights violations to institutional accountability in real time. Users can now document discrimination incidents and automatically notify federal civil rights agencies. Institutional investors and corporate governance organizations announced Twitter Public Policy Director Sarah Kim. Technology enables immediate institutional response to prejudice rather than hoping victims will navigate complex complaint procedures. The technological acceleration of civil rights enforcement meant that discrimination would face institutional consequences within hours rather than years. Corporate consulting firms had established civil rights compliance divisions specifically designed to prevent institutional discrimination before federal investigation became necessary. Companies are investing millions in discrimination prevention rather than facing billions in institutional retaliation, explained McKinsey civil rights partner David Torres. The Mitchell family's financial destruction demonstrates that prejudice prevention costs less than prejudice consequences. The economic incentive for proactive civil rights compliance ensured that discrimination prevention would become standard corporate practice rather than reactive damage control. Sophia Martinez had been invited to address the International Association of Flight Attendants about employee empowerment in civil rights enforcement. Dr. Rodriguez taught me that moral courage creates institutional protection, she told an audience of 12,000 airline workers from 47 countries. When employees know that standing up to discrimination will be supported rather than punished, civil rights enforcement becomes part of professional duty rather than personal risk. Her international platform ensured that airline employees worldwide understood civil rights protection as job security rather than career threat. Maya Rodriguez received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, in recognition of her institutional civil rights leadership. Dr. Rodriguez demonstrated that individual courage combined with institutional authority can eliminate discrimination more effectively than decades of gradual social progress, announced the president during the White House ceremony. Her phone call transformed not just airline policies, but the relationship between corporate power and civil rights enforcement. The presidential recognition ensured that Maya's model of immediate institutional accountability would be remembered as a defining moment in civil rights history. The Mitchell family pharmaceutical empire had been completely liquidated, with all proceeds distributed to civil rights organizations and discrimination victims according to federal bankruptcy court orders. $3 billion in former Mitchell family assets have funded civil rights education, discrimination prevention programs, and victim compensation across 12 states, announced bankruptcy trustee Maria Kim. The family's prejudice has generated permanent institutional benefits for future civil rights protection. The transformation of discriminatory wealth into civil rights funding ensured that the Mitchell family's racism had created lasting benefits for the communities they had tried to exclude. 6 months after Brandon Mitchell demanded that Maya Rodriguez move from Seat 1A, institutional discrimination had been dismantled across American commercial transportation through a combination of federal enforcement, financial accountability, and technological documentation. Individual prejudice could no longer hide behind corporate policies because institutional consequences now moved faster than discriminatory behavior could adapt. 1 year after Maya Rodriguez's phone call transformed institutional discrimination into institutional accountability, she stood at the podium of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, addressing delegates from 193 countries about the global impact of individual courage combined with institutional change. Distinguished representatives, Maya began her voice carrying the same calm authority that had dismantled a pharmaceutical empire with surgical precision. 12 months ago, a young man told me he didn't sit next to people like me. Today, that young man's prejudice has generated civil rights protections for millions of travelers worldwide. The assembly hall fell silent as delegates processed how one moment of discrimination had triggered international transformation of commercial transportation policies. In the audience, Sophia Martinez sat beside her husband Carlos, whom she had met during a civil rights conference in Madrid. Her journey from vulnerable flight attendant to international human rights advocate had been accelerated by Maya's institutional protection, but sustained by her own moral courage. Dr. Rodriguez Sofia whispered to her husband, "Changed my life by showing me that standing up to prejudice creates opportunity rather than destroying it." Her words captured the fundamental lesson that institutional discrimination survived only when good people accepted that fighting back wasn't worth the personal cost. James Liu's documentary, Seat 1, How 8 Words Destroyed an Empire, had been translated into 47 languages and viewed by over 200 million people worldwide. His accidental livestream had evolved into the most comprehensive examination of corporate-enabled discrimination in cinematic history. The footage from Flight 445 has become the most powerful civil rights education tool since Selma announced film critic Janet Kim in the New York Times. Audiences witness institutional discrimination and institutional accountability in real time, making civil rights enforcement visceral rather than abstract. The global reach of James's documentation ensured that Maya's courage would inspire civil rights activism across cultures and continents. Judge Robert and Helen Caldwell had established the Witness Intervention Foundation, training bystanders to recognize and interrupt discrimination rather than remaining passive observers. Discrimination flourishes when good people choose silence over solidarity, Helen explained during their TED Talk that had been viewed 15 million times. Dr. Rodriguez's courage taught us that witnessing prejudice creates moral obligation to intervene. Their foundation ensured that future discrimination would face immediate challenge from trained observers rather than uncomfortable silence from unprepared witnesses. Brandon Mitchell had been released from federal prison after serving 18 months of his 3-year sentence for civil rights violations. He now worked at a community center in Newark, teaching discrimination awareness classes to court-ordered participants. "I destroyed my entire family because I believed my money made me superior to other human beings," he told a class of offenders required to complete civil rights education. "Dr. Rodriguez taught me that prejudice always costs more than it's worth." His transformation from pharmaceutical heir to community educator demonstrated that even privileged bigots could learn humility when consequences were severe enough to penetrate entitled worldviews. Harrison Mitchell had died of a heart attack 6 months into the federal investigation of pharmaceutical discrimination policies. His cooperation with authorities had exposed industry-wide patterns of using financial leverage to enable prejudice, but personal shame over his family's destruction had taken a fatal toll. Harrison Mitchell's death represents the ultimate consequence of institutional discrimination, observed civil rights historian Dr. Elena Santos. He literally couldn't survive the destruction of the empire he had built through enabling prejudice. The pharmaceutical mogul's death served as a stark reminder that discrimination could destroy perpetrators as completely as it damaged victims. Elizabeth Cross had been named to Time magazine's list of most influential people for her institutional response to civil rights violations through financial accountability. Titan Capital's deliberate destruction of the Mitchell pharmaceutical empire demonstrated that private equity could serve social justice as effectively as shareholder profit, announced the magazine's selection committee. Corporate civil rights enforcement through financial leverage has become a model for institutional activism worldwide. Her recognition ensured that financial institutions would continue using economic pressure to enforce civil rights compliance rather than accommodating discrimination for profit. Maya concluded her United Nations address with words that would be inscribed on civil rights monuments in 12 countries. Individual prejudice becomes institutional discrimination when good people choose comfort over courage. Brandon Mitchell's racism survived for 35 years because institutions protected his privilege rather than challenging his prejudice. Change came only when institutional protection ended and institutional consequences began. She paused, looking across the assembly hall at delegates who represented billions of people affected by commercial discrimination. Ladies and gentlemen, civil rights enforcement cannot wait for gradual social evolution. Justice delayed becomes justice denied. When discrimination occurs, institutional response must be immediate, comprehensive, and permanent. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes as delegates from every continent acknowledged that individual courage combined with institutional authority could eliminate discrimination faster than decades of traditional civil rights litigation. As Maya stepped down from the podium, she reflected on how one phone call had demonstrated that institutional discrimination could be dismantled as quickly as it had been constructed, provided the consequences were severe enough to prevent repetition. Sofia Martinez stood to applaud her mentor, remembering the moment 18 months earlier when a quiet woman in seat 1A had transformed her understanding of moral courage. Dr. Rodriguez, Sofia said as they embraced after the speech, "You didn't just stand up for your dignity. You stood up for everyone who comes after us." Maya smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal injustice into universal protection. "Sophia," she replied, "institutional change requires individual courage, but it creates collective safety." Brandon Mitchell's prejudice became everyone's opportunity to build a more just world. As they walked through the United Nations corridors toward the reception, celebrating international civil rights progress, both women understood that their journey from Flight 445 to global recognition had demonstrated a fundamental truth. Discrimination dies when good people refuse to accept that fighting back isn't worth the effort. The airline industry had been permanently transformed. Corporate America had adopted civil rights enforcement as standard practice. International transportation operated under comprehensive anti-discrimination protocols, and it all began with 8 words that revealed how quickly institutional protection could become institutional accountability when moral courage met financial authority. Maya Rodriguez had boarded Flight 445 as a tired executive seeking comfortable transportation to London. She disembarked as a civil rights icon whose institutional response to discrimination had reshaped commercial transportation worldwide. Brandon Mitchell had demanded Seat 1A, believing his pharmaceutical wealth made him untouchable. He learned that some mistakes trigger permanent consequences that money cannot purchase or influence cannot corrupt. The quiet woman reading a book in first class had taught the world that justice doesn't require noise, it requires results. And sometimes the most dangerous person on an airplane is the one who knows exactly who to call when dignity becomes negotiable. In first-class cabins around the world, passengers now travel with the knowledge that discrimination will face immediate institutional consequences rather than corporate accommodation. Flight attendants enforce civil rights with federal protection rather than corporate pressure. Airline executives understand that enabling prejudice costs more than preventing it, all because Dr. Maya Rodriguez refused to accept that her seat was someone else's to take. The revolution began with a phone call. It ended with a new world where respect isn't negotiable, dignity isn't transferable, and justice moves at the speed of institutional accountability rather than the pace of gradual change. Sometimes the person who changes everything is sitting quietly in Seat 1. Reading a book and waiting for someone to make the mistake of underestimating what happens when moral courage meets institutional power. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, or if you've ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of who they are, this story is for you. It's a reminder that one person's courage to stand up can change entire industries. What did you think of Dr. Maya Rodriguez's response? Was justice served, or did Brandon Mitchell get what he deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that respect should never depend on your bank account or your last name, then do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It helps more people discover stories like this. Subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss when we drop new stories of justice, courage, and people who refused to stay silent. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their dignity is not negotiable. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they are. Until next time, remember you never know who's sitting in Seat 1A. Treat everyone with respect because the quiet person reading a book might just be the one who can change your entire world with a single phone call. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.